Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chet, and I'm this year's U.S. Navy Federal Executive Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone, especially our members, for joining us for today's On the Record program. Before we get too far, I have a few housekeeping points. First, if you'd like to submit a question to today's panel, please visit ccga.live. That's ccga.live on your web browser. You can submit questions as well as upvote questions that you like, and I will pose them to the panel at the end of today's moderated discussion. As a reminder, the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed here by individuals are their own and do not represent institutional positions or the views of the Council. First, we are very grateful for support for today's program from the Consulate General of Japan in Chicago. And now it's my honor to turn the floor over to Consul General Hiroshi Tajima virtually for some opening remarks.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to join you all to say a few words at today's symposium. The topic of this symposium is key to helping understand one of the most important components forming the current Japan-US relationship. The government of Japan has been promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific, FOIP in short, which is a vision for ensuring peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. I have been involved in Southeast and Southwest Asian affairs throughout my career. I have witnessed the seas, especially those in the Indo-Pacific, become the stage for the rapid rise of emerging countries. The vision of FOIP, which is to develop a free and open Indo-Pacific region as international public goods by ensuring a rule-based international order in a comprehensive, inclusive, and transparent manner, has crucial importance to the region as well as to international society as a whole. FOIP is now gaining a broad support in the international community. In Japan, prime ministers and foreign ministers have been consistently advocating the importance of universal values such as freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, and in particular, abiding by and advancing the rules governing the seas and oceans. Since President Biden took office, both the president and Japanese leaders have reaffirmed their commitment to policies based on FOIP on numerous occasions. Japan's foreign minister is having phone conversations with Secretary of State Blinken almost every month, during which they exchange views on FOIP. Japan-US cooperation is steadily progressing, not only in the bilateral context, but also among Quad, with Australia and India together. In the face-to-face Quad Leaders Summit held in Washington, D.C. in September of last year, the four leaders expressed strong commitments to the Indo-Pacific region in their efforts towards achieving this vision. It is encouraging to see today that experts on Asian security issues and diplomatic policies are discussing FOIP. Expanding public awareness and deepening existing understanding of FOIP forges a strong foundation for the Japanese and US governments to promote their policies and to further bilateral cooperation. Since today's symposium features experts on the topic, I welcome you to enjoy today's distinguished speakers who will lead you to a deeper insight and a more robust understanding of what FOIP entails. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you again to Consul General Tajima for both the support and today's warm welcome. It's now my great honor to introduce today's speakers. Our first speaker is Michael J. Green. He is the Senior Vice President for Asia, the Japan Chair, and the Henry A. Kissinger Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's also the Director of Asia Studies at Georgetown University, and he has served on the staff of the National Security Council, first as Director for Asian Affairs, then later as a Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and the Senior Director for Asia. In addition, we have Ms. Maria Solis. She's the Director of the Center of East Asia Policy Studies, the Philip Knight Chair in Japan Studies, and a senior fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution. She's an expert on Japanese foreign policy, economic policy, US-Japan relations, international trade policy, and Asia-Pacific economic integration. Finally, we're joined by Ms. Yuki Tatsumi, who is the Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program, as well as the Director of the Japan Program at the Stimson Center. Previously, she's worked as a Research Associate at CSIS and as Special Assistant for Political Affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. Thank you for all our panelists and also to the audience for joining us today. Next, we will move on to the moderated portion of today's discussion. Again, if any of these questions I pose stirring interest amongst our audience, be sure to go to the website I put out and ask your questions. And at the completion of the moderated portion, I'll move on and address the interesting audience provided questions. So my first question for the panel is, in December of 2021, Secretary of State Antony Blinken pledged that the United States will work toward a free and open Indo-Pacific. In your opinions, what does this mean, and what is its political, security, and economic significance for the region?
Who would you like to open up, Chet?
Well, it seems like you're volunteering, Michael. So I first.
Very good. Well, the free and open Indo-Pacific, that description of our strategy is full of meaning, actually. I think Secretary Blinken clearly meant that the United States would work with Japan and other allies to maintain an open rules-based order, one based on a common set of economic rules consistent with the global Bretton Woods system that have benefited so many countries, in which Mireya is an expert on, but also that the US, Japan, and other allies would resist coercion coming in the aftermath of Chinese boycotts and embargoes against Australia, against Japan, Mongolia, pressure on Taiwan. And so it's really a commitment to preserve an open order and to push back against coercion and pressure by Beijing. But it's also very interesting to me because of its provenance, where that whole concept came from. Free and open Indo-Pacific was a Japanese strategic concept articulated 7 years ago by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And when the Trump administration came into office in 2017, and Secretary of State Tillerson needed to give a speech at CSIS, at my home institution, they didn't have a theme. And they borrowed this free and open Indo-Pacific concept from Prime Minister Abe. When Joe Biden came into office, advisors around him said, you can't use the free and open Indo-Pacific. That's a Trump phrase. But the advisors to President Biden who knew Asia said, no, it's a Japanese phrase, and we agree with it. So its provenance, the source of this is quite interesting because it shows alignment between the US and Japan on what we're about, and bipartisan continuity across two very different administrations. There are very few things Republicans and Democrats agree on these days, but the US-Japan alliance is one of them. And so it shows resolve, it shows alignment with our closest ally, Japan, and it's a concept that's attracting others. Australia, the European Union, the British are all starting to use this free and open Indo-Pacific and this Indo-Pacific concept. Because of the recognition of what's at stake in terms of the economic system we enjoy and the values we share, and the challenge to it from China. But it's not an anti-China containment concept. It's about preserving what is good about the region and the trajectory that we thought was the right trajectory. Now, there's a lot of problems with it, especially on the economic side, which Mireya can speak to, but that's what I heard in the Blinken speech.
So maybe let me, Mireya, I'm gonna learn so much from what you're gonna say about trade and economics. So let me get my 2 cents in before I start in a listening mode. Thank you, first of all, Chicago Council of Global Affairs, for giving me this opportunity. It's great to share a panel with, of course, with Mireya, but then my big senpai Mike. It's always a pleasure. Just to supplement what Mike had already
So let me join the conversation. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be with all of you, and very much in agreement with what Mike and Yuki have already said. So just to add a little bit to this, Chet, you mentioned the speech by Mr. Blinken in Jakarta last December. And to me, the phrase that mattered the most from that speech was when he referred to the Indo-Pacific as defining the future of the 21st century. And I think that's what really evokes for me this concept of a free and Indo-Pacific. Two fundamental facts, I would say. One is the critical importance of the Indo-Pacific to U.S. national security interest. It's a region that has it all, for the good and the bad, in the sense that you have a peer competitor of the United States in China, risen power with regional and global influence. You also have the most dynamic economic region in the world, where you have very important consolidated democracies that are also in the lead when it comes to frontier technologies, certainly on the semiconductor industry and other advanced manufacturing, the hotspots of North Korea and the Taiwan Strait, but also a very networked region. And this is not the way in which we used to talk about Asia or in Indo-Pacific in the past, but it's one where the regional architecture is becoming consolidated with mega trade agreements, where we see, of course, enduring US alliances, but also new ways to promote security cooperation. So there's been a booming of bilaterals, trilaterals, and the Quad. So there's a lot here, room for diplomatic action of the United States in bringing together this region with a set of principles, freedom of navigation, rule of law, rules-based economic interaction. But I would also say, and I think it's important to talk about how the free and open Indo-Pacific idea is also very attractive to many of the critical regional players. We frequently make the remark that countries in Asia do not want to choose. They don't want to be dragged into the US-China strategic competition and forced to surrender the economic integration. But it's also equally true that none of them want to see the United States lose the race and do not keep up with China, because life in a neighborhood where there's a single pole of power and it comes with China's characteristics would be very challenging to the other actors in the region, given China's expansive views on territorial disputes and its increasing resort to economic coercion. So I think that both Mike and Yuki already highlighted the strong degree of convergence when it comes to Japanese strategic thinking about what kind of regional blueprint you want to advance. And this is what the Free and Open Indo-Pacific does. It gives you an idea of membership and principles for behavior and interaction among its members.
All right, thank you. And I have a follow-up to that question, and I'll pose it first to Michael, having worked within an administration. Along this pathway to a free and open Indo-Pacific, what progress would you say the Biden administration has made towards that goal thus far?
One of the most important things to do in strategy is to understand the assumptions that animate your concept. And in contrast to the Obama administration, where there were huge debates internally about which way China was heading, whether or not we should push back against some of China's grabs in the South China Sea, building artificial islands. In this administration, there's not a debate about what China's intentions are. I think there's a consensus. In some ways, historians like Hal Brands are comparing it to the George Kennan articles at the beginning of the Cold War. And his articles really were about the nature of Soviet behavior. That was the first thing we had to figure out before that long competition. What are they after? And I think there's a consensus, and Xi Jinping in Beijing has telegraphed this, that China seeks to supplant the US as the primary power in this region. And so that's one of the great strengths of this administration. They all get it across the Asia leads in defense and state and NSC. They all agree on that premise. They have bipartisan support for that. That's the most important thing, is recognize the problem and that you need to do something about it. The second thing I think they've done very well on is external balancing and external alignment. The Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, India grouping, which was started when I was in the White House as a naval task force to respond to the big tsunami in 2004 and the 2005 recovery. It went from that to, under President Biden, a quite active summit meeting of leaders. And AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK Trilateral Security Cooperation, building new nuclear-powered submarines for the Royal Australian Navy, but a lot more. So they've done very, very well on aligning with allies and lining up with allies. That's another big strength. I'm going to, maybe cue Mireille, because the shortcomings are primarily in the area of economic statecraft, where I think basically they get either an F or an incomplete so far. And that's where the region wants to see more. That's where Prime Minister Kishida in his phone call with Joe Biden last week said, we need to see more. He hears it from all the regional leaders. That's probably where they're either, like I said, if it's not an F, I'm a tougher grader than Mireille, maybe, I don't know. It's at least an incomplete, because without an economic pillar to the strategy, it's a one-legged stool.
So I guess that was my cue. Is it okay, Chet, if I jump in? I do think that, the return of diplomacy, the recognition that we need to work with allies and partners if we really want to address the China challenge effectively, those are very positives. Elevating the Quad to a leaders summit, also very positive, and AUKUS that that redraws the lines of, again, that security cooperation between Australia, the UK, and the United States for nuclear-powered submarines. Those are all very good. What I would like to see is an AUKUS on the economic side, if you will, something that really changes the narrative, the conversation, that excites our partners and that puts our rivals and competitors on notice. And that's what has not been seen by any stretch. So it is really on the economic engagement side where the weaknesses lie. For example, what to do with China, how to engage effectively with China. Obviously, that existing economic integration is not going to disappear, but how can we try to make China not pursue these market distorting policies, not use its market power to try to penalize others? I think that the Biden administration is very aware, very cognizant of intelligence here. But when it actually revealed what it was going to be its China trade policy, it was actually a continuation of the Trump's trade policy and keeping the tariffs in place. And there was no real insight as to how we can make a dent on China's industrial policy and digital protectionism. So even though Biden administration has criticized the Trump's trade approach on China, they have not really offered something new. And we don't have anything on the table for a significant trade agreement negotiation. We're not hinting that we can come back to the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, not even real clarity in a digital negotiation. But I would go further than that. It's not just trade. We should be doing much more on vaccine diplomacy. We should be doing so much more infrastructure finance. There are these rhetorical moves, build back better for the world, but it feels like you're just talking about loosely putting together everything that your partners do and call that a strategy, a concerted effort. And we know that that's not how these things actually take off. So my last point would be this. Indeed, let's treat our partners like partners all the time, not just when we want to enlist them vis-a-vis defensive measures with China. But there's a lot of protectionism built in the Biden trade approach, and that I think is of concern.
Okay, while we're on economy, I'm going to try to get a little clarity into what you just said. You talked about us probably not being able to revisit TPP. Is there room for a new economic framework? And in your opinion, what does that look like in the region?
If Yuki or anybody wants to jump in, let me know. But just very briefly, there is indeed an Indo-Pacific economic framework that is being discussed, and we expect some news soon. And I think that there's real appetite in the region to see what that will be. And we know already it's not going to be a traditional trade agreement with market access front and center, perhaps not even anything that goes through a congressional vote. So the longevity of the agreement is also an important consideration. But there's plenty that can be done on supply chain resilience, on digital trade facilitation, on climate change, on tech standards. And I think that's where this initiative is going. Now, what's going to be important is that, and of course, environmental and labor standards, which are a very important effort now for the Biden administration. I think what's going to be very important is that we put something on the table that is attractive to our counterparts, that it's not just our agenda, but what they want us to do. And trade integration or a trade agreement, a digital trade agreement, is something that would generate a lot of attention. And that we don't just move with, coordination forums. I think it's very ironic. If you look at the history of US policy on Asia, economic integration, we used to be very, very critical about talk shops and just getting together to talk and not have binding commitments. And I think it's interesting to see that perhaps that's where we're moving towards. And that would not be good news when you have mega trade agreements that do have binding commitments and make a difference in the way in which investment and trade flows evolve.
Thank you. Do any of our other panelists have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I have a quick couple of points to make. So I think it is really interesting that the recent U.S.-Japan 2+2 joint statement mentioned the de facto economic 2+2. And I do think that is an attempt by Japanese side to rope, for the lack of better words, integrate U.S. back into somehow this regional trade dynamics. And since for the moment, it's still the trade approach for this administration is still very much on the bilateral reciprocity based approach, the way to address these economic and trade issues in a more of a broader scale by giving it a name of economic 2+2, it did, I guess Japan did succeed in providing the Washington a venue to address this issue a little bit more broader way. And hopefully that will give some segue into U.S. Engaging a little bit more on a broader basis. And if I can say one more thing, is that one thing that the Biden administration, I think, has started off right is what Mike alluded to, which is to repair the alliances. And that was actually really the step number one for this administration to start with. It's just not about Indo-Pacific, but it's also in Europe too. But then their effort really was taking place at a confluence of things were happening when, like Mike alluded to, U.S. administration, within the U.S. administration, there's a less debate about Chinese directions and intentions. and the assessment of its behaviors. And that similar perceptions and the assessment is more and more shared more broadly across the globe, not just limited to Indo-Pacific. And then I think that is one of the reasons why Quad becomes so energized now in the last year or so. And shared perception, increasingly shared perception of Chinese behaviors, its directions and intentions is really a big one accelerating factor. But then also that flip side of the coin is that what happens when that shared perception starts to weaken a little bit.
Can I just add, I think the administration it's not quite an AUKUS, it's not quite as bold, to Maria's point, but I do think the administration can fill the vacuum left by the U.S. withdrawal from TPP if they do something more concrete than just dialogue, not just talk shops, more concrete in the areas of digital trade, technology standards. You know, we, Japan, Australia, Canada, key countries have got to do a better job defining how our 5G network will be organized. We don't want Huawei and China in it, we've all decided. So what will be in it? So that's a really important area. And supply chain security, digital trade, meaning, you know, reciprocity of access to data and so forth. All of these are things that are really important and would show leadership on the cutting edge technologies and economic issues. It will not replace, in my view, completely the vacuum left by TPP. And I think every one of our allies in Asia wants us to get back to TPP, because that will determine more than anything else where companies are going to invest. I mean, there are other things that will, in terms of government actions, that's going to be critical. There are hundreds of millions of dollars sitting on the sideline waiting to see what's going to happen to TPP and these trade agreements before they invest and figure out. So supply chain management is not just about regulatory issues, it's about behind the border protections for investments and things that are in these trade agreements. So if the US doesn't get eventually back to something like TPP, we still are going to be behind. We can fill that space now. And the Chicago Council's own surveys show that there's more support in the American public for global trade and more of a view that it's good for us than ever. So I think it's all about leadership and priorities. And if a future administration decides they want to do something like TPP, I think they can sell it to the American public. But the politics just aren't there for the next few years. And that's why, you know, the closest we'll get to a big move like AUKUS is something more concrete than just dialogue on digital trade and 5G and things like that. And if the administration can't do that, what'll happen is China has asked to join CPTPP and basically fill the space left by the US. The Japanese and Australians will hold them off, but not forever. Some people say they've got a year, some people say it's 3 or 4 years, but sooner or later, China will push its way into that big trade agreement, and then we'll really be in trouble, because they'll be the dominant, force determining rules that affect our companies in that absolutely vital region.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more before we go to the audience generated questions. So turning to the elephant in the region, China. So as China continues its economic, political, and military expansion in the region, adding pressure to both U.S. strategy and influence, can the U.S. leverage support of its Indo-Pacific allies to build a free and open region, while so many of them are also economically intertwined with China? And for that, I'll throw it first to Yuki, being representing a country in the region.
I'm not quite sure if I can represent the whole of the country, but that is definitely a challenge for all the countries in the Indo-Pacific. But then I would say this challenge is really met by countries beyond that region as well, but more acutely so in the Indo-Pacific. And then I think Japan has been after the U.S. withdrew from TPP. I think Japan spent all that time between since then to now to set place especially when it comes to economic and trade, to basically salvage what's left of TPP. And then not only that, they had embarked on this mega trade agreement with Europe and bilateral trade agreement with UK after the Brexit. And also on the political military side too, Japan really intensified its effort to really shore up its security cooperation relationship with the other U.S. Allies and partners in the region. And most recently, just days before US-Japan 2+2, Japan actually signed the reciprocal access agreement with Australia that really gives the two militaries jointly operating much smoother. And now that the U.S.-Japan trilateral, the three countries do so much in terms of joint exercising and training, and the cross using each other's facilities. This RAA will give a big boost in smoothing out whatever the hurdles that Japan and Austria may have had up to that point. And we have already spent quite some time talking about the Quad, and how now what actually started as, like Mike said, the disaster relief group in response to tsunami, and then revamped as a strategic dialogue amongst the foreign ministers among the four countries. Now it's actually a semi-institutionalized framework where there's a leader summit, there's a senior officials meeting, and there's actually a specific issue working group like digital trade, vaccine distribution and production, and so on and so forth. So I would say it is a task that is not easy for regional countries to continue to meet the Chinese economic pressure, especially without U.S. presence in the region. But I think that is why region really welcomes the Biden administration's really intensified effort into this in this region. One source of concern, which is more of a short term, but how this current Ukraine crisis will affect U.S. policies and priorities moving forward. Does that mean that just like past administration, many administration, they did talk about the strategic importance of the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region, but then when the crisis of today arrives at their desk, then the strategic important region, because it has been a long term, more or less, start taking a hit in terms of immediate policy attention. What has changed between now and then is that China was not as of an acute concern for the U.S. back then, and now it is. But then we still don't know how this whole Ukraine crisis will shake out, and let alone what kind of lasting impact it may or may not leave for the Biden administration, the foreign policy moving forward.
Chet, about a decade ago, an Australian scholar named Hugh White wrote a book called China Choice, which argued since all of America's allies, Japan, Australia, Korea, were trading more with China than the US, then they had to make a choice, and the implication was they'd choose China. And all the polls show it's not happening. The opposite is happening. And one reason is because he was looking at trade, and trade is like dating. Foreign direct investment is like marriage. And if you look at foreign direct investment, opening factories, investing in countries for the long haul, it's overwhelmingly trans-Pacific. It's overwhelmingly, the US completely outpaces China in both directions with these countries. There's far more FDI between the US and Australia than there is Australia and China, for example. And the second thing is China ruined it, because in the subsequent decade, Xi Jinping made it very dangerous to depend on China's economy. And the Australians have learned this more than anyone, because he's boycotted their imports to try to punish them over diplomatic issues. And finally, the US also has this dilemma. In China's top 10 export markets, one has to include Walmart, one US company. And the top destination for US soybean exports is China. So we also, in our economy, have these choices. And so we can manage this. If we go for complete decoupling and containment, we'll lose our allies. If we push back against Chinese, predatory economics, we'll have allies. I don't think this is a dilemma the way a lot of people once thought it was. And the Australians, more than anyone, have proven that that's the case.
Just two observations. Obviously the pool of the Chinese market is huge, and we've seen China use its leverage by, blocking imports of countries that it wants to penalize. But we're focusing, when we think of that as Chinese power or influence, we're focusing on its short-term effects, and there are longer-term consequences. And I think that China is not playing all its cards as wisely as sometimes portrayed, because it can actually result in some very important economic initiatives. I'm thinking about the investment agreement with the Europeans that was frozen. I'm thinking about the fact that many countries in the region, including Japan now, openly articulate concerns with over-dependence with China, and they're trying to provide subsidies to some very specific and strategic sectors to diversify. That is the genesis of the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative that is now bringing together a number of countries. So we shouldn't assume that China exercising its economic muscle does not have consequences for China itself in the long term. And the other, to what everybody has said, I would just add that I think the game is about providing alternatives to developing countries in Asia. And in one arena, Mike mentioned foreign direct investment. In another one where Japan is playing a critical role is infrastructure finance. Because Japan actually has been doing this for decades, and because it does not generate the debt sustainability concerns that sometimes Chinese projects generate. And there is less political interference or no political interference because of these projects. I think that becomes more attractive to the recipients in the country, in the region. And again, if you want to compete with China, you have to put something on the table. It has to be an affirmative, a proactive strategy, played across all dimensions of economic statecraft.
All right, thank you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to pivot quickly to our audience generated questions. And luckily that last question hit on a lot of what people have been asking. But firstly, one that we didn't touch on really, this one's for Yuki. What kind of support domestically is there within Japan for the type of initiatives we've talked about?
I'd say when it comes to political security issues, there's a lot of support. I think if there's one sea change in Japanese discourse that I can point to, is really the discourse on China and to some extent Taiwan. That there are more and more high-profile political leaders who's not hesitant to articulate their concerns about how peace and stability of Taiwan Strait directly impacts that of Japan. That is one one big of a sea change that I've been noticing. And when it comes to economic and trade, I think the Japanese public by and large is still on a waiting mode to see what Prime Minister Kishida tried to articulate under his own banner of a new types of capitalism, which under which banner he claims that he would like to pursue both growth and redistribution of wealth. And how does that translate into actual trade and economic practices? Japanese public is still, I think, on hold to watch that. But then I think when it comes to the effort to push back the Chinese more of an economic aggressive behavior, sometimes can be predatory, there is a solid support against that. Japan has been often at the forefront of it. If you can recall, when the Japanese Coast Guard vessels were rammed by a Chinese fishing boat, and the Japanese authorities arrested those crew from China, China was really quick to arrest some of the detain the Japanese businessmen in China under the name of the potential economic espionage, and then they really curtail heavily of Chinese export of rare earth to Japan, which is critical in some of the IT components that they produce. So Japan has also felt this, like Australia, that China really doesn't hesitate to use economic coercion to try to achieve its diplomatic goals. So whatever the effort that the Japanese government in response and in together with the U.S. and other like-minded countries to fend off those pressures, there will be a lot of support within the country. I mean, of course, like Mike said, Japanese corporation also does benefit from the pull from the Chinese market. So there is also always a complication there. But then I don't think that is unique to Japan.
Thank you. My next question from the audience is, so we talked about earlier, Michael, you led off with this, how this policy has managed to transcend the previous administration and now this one. Do you foresee that this will continue past the next election in 2024?
I think that it will. I did a 8-year study and wrote a long book on the history of U.S. strategic approaches to Asia since 1783, and this really feels like one of those moments where we are embarking on a generational competition, and I don't think that will change. I don't see a president coming in and saying we got this wrong, we should have a G2 with China. I just don't think the American public won't support it. Congress won't support it, nor do I see a president coming in, barring some major shock or aggressive move by China, and saying we should decouple and contain China. We're in that mode now that we're going to, continue. I think, to me, the big variables, the big questions are how effectively will we execute this strategy. Right now, honestly, a lot of it hangs on a good friend of the three of ours, Kurt Campbell in the White House, who's the senior coordinator. A lot of it hangs on him. Different personalities bring different, approaches and different levels of effectiveness. Honestly, this is at the cabinet level a group of outstanding public servants and career diplomats and so forth, but with very few exceptions, almost entirely schooled in the Middle East or transatlantic business, not schooled in the Asia world. So, personalities do matter, and so that will affect things. And as Yuki said, outside shocks. Yes, we generally agree on this free and open Indo-Pacific. Our surveys, Chicago Council surveys, show 60, 70, 80% support for this general approach of working with allies and shoring up Asia against Chinese coercion. That's all true, but how important is that if Russia invades Ukraine or if Iran starts testing nuclear weapons? So how disciplined will they be? Will they be able to avoid chasing after other crises? Those are the kind of questions, but the general trajectory, yeah, I think this is what the next president and the president after that are going to be doing.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more audience question here. I think this is probably best suited for Maria. So the region's massive. If you just look alone at China, India, Indonesia, I think that's the majority of the Earth's population. What infrastructure investments are underway right now to increase connectivity amongst the population in the Indo-Pacific?
A lot is happening, both on the physical and the digital side of infrastructure. So it's transportation corridors, high-speed trains. It's the development of smart cities. It's the suite of digital technologies that enable that digital push, cashless payments, e-commerce platforms. That is all happening. Obviously, it's not happening in a uniform way, but it is indeed what the region is most interested in. And we've known for several years that there is an infrastructure finance gap. And I think that's the opportunity, the strategic opportunity that China identified. Japan had been doing it for a while, but Japan also has now, quite greater resolve, if you will, in launching the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. And the investments are happening. And obviously, we're talking about very large populations in the countries you mentioned, and a lot of need to make sure that you can indeed provide the manufacturing bases, the transportation, logistics, the ports, and so forth. But they're focused, all of them, on the need to do that, because this is a region that would like to push forward with a very proactive growth strategy. Now, of course, with COVID-19, we also have challenges, and I think that the dislocation of some supply chains has been very significant. The lockdowns and what happens with China with their zero tolerance towards COVID, that's also going to affect the growth prospects for the region. It's not just in terms of supplying infrastructure finance, but also remaining that engine for growth. And China is also revisiting its economic model with a dual circulation strategy and aiming for a greater self-resilience. So again, very important developments within the region, and how the United States then seeks to identify new opportunities. And I would not like to close on a pessimistic note, But I agree with Mike that indeed the trajectory is set, but our own domestic politics are going to become more fractious, not less. And our foreign policy is built on our identity as a democracy, and I would say that we're in a battle for democracy right now in the next months and a couple of years. So all of that will also affect the future of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, as often happens with good conversations, we've run out of time. So with that, I'd like to again thank our three panelists for offering their expert insight into the region. And again, I'd like to thank the Consulate General of Japan for their support and also for his welcoming remarks via video. With that, I will bid everyone farewell, and thank you for everyone out in virtual land for joining us. It was a great conversation. I hope everyone got a lot out of it. Again, thank you and have a good evening.
Thanks, Chet. Thank you all.
Yeah.